Hey, folks, welcome to episode 1 of the podcast, videocast, vodcast, whatever you want to call it. I'm your host, Karl Zahn. Struggled a little bit with naming this thing because what we want to do here is have kind of a pragmatic approach, dig in a little bit to all the things that are happening in the country, and with a little bit of New Hampshire Yankee ingenuity, common sense flair overriding the whole thing. Tell you a little bit about myself first. Former professional stand-up comedian for about 15 years in Boston, New England, New York. I have had numerous talk shows on radio in New Hampshire over the last couple decades, on and off. I was a former panel member on the original Red Eye with Greg Gutfeld way back in the day with Bill Schultz and the Talking New York Times. And I was a regular in-studio guest and co-host with Dennis Miller on the Dennis Miller radio show. So just kind of explaining myself because of the ocean of podcasts that are out there these days, and so many people wanting to have a voice. And so I decided to put myself in there to talk about things with everything that's happening in the country. I'm the son of a World War II veteran, so to a certain degree, and the father of 5 children, so to a certain degree, I feel duty-bound to have a voice with everything that's going on in the world today. And as I said, it will be political. I'm a self-avowed political wonk, but I really want to separate this from Republican, Democrat party ideology to just kind of a common sense approach to all the division that's going on in the country here, which is eclipsing the sun. So a little bit more, I worked on the late Senator McCain's campaign many years ago, got to know him a little bit, and certainly didn't agree with him on many things politically, but I always admired his service to the country. Did get to know him a little bit, spent a day riding the Straight Talk Express. Really complex man, funny, great sense of humor. That was a great experience, being involved with that. So long and short of it is, I was doing stand-up comedy. I took a hiatus from that about 6 years ago. I've got, as I mentioned, 5 kids. My youngest is 18, and I had to kind of put comedy aside and the traveling that goes with it to pay attention to navigating a young girl through 2024 America, which is a bit like flying a DC-3 with 2 engines on fire through a tornado. So that's led to my hiatus in comedy. So I am a Trump supporter, but I want to talk about why, because I think a lot of people don't understand that. And I'm not here to win hearts and minds. I think there was a time before Trump ran for president and won where I thought maybe some marriage counseling could work for the country, but I have long since abandoned that idea. I think we are headed for a national divorce, and it's probably time to split up the furniture. I don't see I think people are pretty dug in, but I still want to explain how I view the support of Donald Trump from people I know and how it came to me. So way back in April of 2016, I got a phone call from a friend of mine that I had worked on Senator McCain's campaign with. And he told me that Donald Trump was going to be in Nashville, New Hampshire on the following Saturday morning. It was invitation-only event, and at the time I was doing a radio show at WTPL in New Hampshire. So I qualified for the media pass to get invited to this thing. And my response to this guy was, if this is about Donald Trump running for president, I said, I really don't think I'm interested. I don't know much about him. I didn't watch The Apprentice and all that. But I said, he just strikes me as kind of a New York blowhard. I don't think I'm interested in that. And he said, well, it's going to be a free steak and egg breakfast. So like any good cheapskate, I said, yeah, I'll go. And I did bring a friend of mine, and we did go for the free breakfast, full disclosure. And I have to say, so I went to this event probably only 15, 16, 17 people in the audience. And Trump blows in and comes in and speaks for an hour and a half, unscripted, fascinating conversation, great sense of humor, just a lot of things. The whole thing just took me completely by surprise. He spoke about things that really resonated. And one of the things I still remember to this day, I was talking about in true Trump fashion, he goes, I travel all over the world. I go to some of the best airports, Shanghai, Taiwan, sweeping architecture, brand new airports, state-of-the-art technology. And then we come home and land in Newark with potholes in the runways and rats dragging carrots through the terminal and ceiling tiles falling off. And I still remember this because it was such a great description, and it's so true. And he went on to say that, and accurately, I believe, we're led by idiots. We spend money all over the world while our own infrastructure decays. And I just remember that visual that he gave about returning home to Newark and saying that Newark used to be the airport of the place that you left. And you said to yourself, I can't wait to get back to America. So very interesting event that day, changed me, quite honestly. And when he was done speaking, he came over to a table where I was sitting with a friend of mine and spent probably 5 or 10 minutes talking to us. And I told him, I said, I know just enough people to be dangerous politically in New Hampshire. And I was completely honest with him. I said, I came here for the free breakfast, but you really sold me in your message. And I really felt at the time, I said, I think your message might carry. And I'll get into the reasoning for that further in. So I left that afternoon. I went home and I wrote a piece for our kind of most major New Hampshire paper, the Union Leader, which used to be a conservative paper, but has kind of gone the way of most newspapers. But I wrote a piece that afternoon, and the gist of it was, this is what happens after a 35-year bad marriage with my politicians. I've fallen in love with a hooker, and I'm running off. And I don't think that's far off from how a lot of people perceive Trump. I've always been an independent. I think both parties are increasingly corrupt. I'm not a big fan of Democrats, not a big fan of Republicans. Again, I consider myself a pragmatist. I like things that make common sense. I think most things should have a logic trail that leads to a conclusion. And I'm certainly open to, when having conversations with people, if there's somewhere along the line that my logic trail escapes you, I'm more than happy to talk about it. But this piece I wrote for Trump, I really sensed, I said, wow, there's a big segment of the population, I think for 20 or 30 years, that has been feeling as though, blue collar America, working people, they try to play by the rules. They pay their bills, they pay their college education for their kids like I did, and a lot of us do. And increasingly over the last several decades, we get painted as rubes and rednecks and kind of not that bright. And I think it could be said that, how long can you do that before people become vulnerable to running off with a political hooker like Trump? So I got involved with his campaign. And about 2 weeks after I wrote this piece, I got an email from a woman in New York who said, per Mr. Trump's request, please see the attached. He had copied the article I wrote and signed it and thanked me, which really meant a lot to me. And also told me something about Trump. I mean, here's a guy with businesses all over the world. He had to have this woman find me and find my email and find out who I was. And he, took the time to do that. And that meant a lot to me. And I also thought it was revealing. So I got involved with his campaign early on, and this was well before he announced, the big escalator ride, which is when he made his public announcement, and that's when most people refer to Trump getting in the race. But prior to that, I was working with a real skeleton crew of volunteers at his Manchester campaign headquarters. And I did have occasion on 2 or 3 times to meet him in a very, setting of 4 or 5 people and Trump and his bodyguard, and able to have very honest, open, casual conversations with him. And the more I got to know him a little bit and watch him, I began to understand very complex, fascinating man. I also think he has a big soft side. I think he's way more forgiving and empathetic than a lot of people perceive him to be. So working on this campaign was utter fascination, because one of the first things that I noticed about Trump, everybody, if you follow politics, has heard of the third rail of politics, right? Abortion, these subjects that you never go close to. And people who traditionally campaigned Hillary Clinton, Obama, avoid the third rail. Now, here comes Trump, who's not only not avoiding the third rail, he's grabbing it around the neck and dry humping it. I mean, it was fascinating to watch. And you can make an argument to this day that Trump supporters and supporting Trump, it might be the political equivalent of revenge porn. But, something leads up to revenge porn, right? Something leads up to so many people being drawn to a guy that, as I said earlier, likes to, a little bit graphic, but dry hump the political third rail. He was not afraid of any of that. And it was fascinating working on his campaign. One of the first things that we did for him was a little backyard barbecue in Bedford, New Hampshire. So this was at someone's home, maybe 100, 150 people. But all the major news cameras showed up. And this is when Trump first began with the fake news. These people are awful, all of that stuff. And again, totally unorthodox at the time. Politicians just did not do that. And so watching this happening, and very refreshing. And so after that little event, we're standing in the driveway, and it's former President Trump, his bodyguard. I had one of my sons that I had invited to the event, Dominic, and I brought him there because I said, if what I think could happen happens, you'll be telling your grandkids about this someday, because this could be historic. And I sensed that early on, as did a lot of other people. I'm no genius. I could see it. I could feel it. So after this little thing in Bedford, he said, well, I want to come back to New Hampshire in a couple of weeks. Why don't you find a place up in the Lakes region for us to hold an event? So we found a Grange Hall in Laconia that seats like 130 people. It was on a Thursday afternoon at 4 o'clock. And of course, the volunteers get up there early to set up chairs and stuff like that. Well, 3,500 people showed up to this event in Laconia. It was like Aerosmith was coming to town. When I worked for Senator McCain, if we got 70 people to a VFW town hall, that was considered a good night. It's politics. You don't draw crowds like the Rolling Stones. So we hold this event in Laconia. Trump shows up with his entourage. I mean, it's a big deal when he shows up. It's, black Escalades rolling in and crowds of people. And Trump comes up, he's walking up the walkway, and he sees me. At that point, we knew each other a little bit. And in reference to the article that I had written for the union leader, he put his hand on my shoulder and he said, the union leader thought you were fucking crazy. And those were his exact words. And my response to him was, we'll see who's crazy, because I always point to that day in Laconia, New Hampshire. Again, this was before the big escalator ride. And I'm always surprised that doesn't get called on more in the press and like the history of the emergence of Trump, that this was just a phenomenal day. People were parachuting in. They're walking out of the woods or coming up out of the lake water. It's just insane. And so I became really fascinated, or more fascinated at that point, with the whole Trump phenomenon. And I ended up working almost every event of his, with the exception of 2 or 3 in New Hampshire. So saw this grow from 100 people, 3,500 people, Then he makes his formal announcement in Trump Tower. And after that, his events were drawing 10, 15, 20,000 people. Just utterly crazy and completely unorthodox politically. So clearly something's happening here. How did we get there? Well, going back to what I said earlier, we got there through 30 years of working class Americans, blue collar people in general, not to throw people into one class, but increasingly and rightfully dismayed with the corruption in Washington. They want more and more of our tax money. They spend it more and more frivolously. Our wants, needs, desires become increasingly overlooked and dismissed. Indeed, we became used to politicians who go out on a campaign trail and say, I'm going to do this, 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 and this, and then they get elected and do nothing of it. So to me, it's an expected result. It had to happen, and I think Trump was the voice at the right place at the right time. And we all know what's happened since then with the subsequent campaign, his presidency, the emergence of COVID, the damage that did to the country, and all these things further dividing the country. The COVID thing was a perfect example of how, as that emerged, it kind of became a defining mark of your political leanings, right? If you were wearing 3 masks and rubber gloves and you were sterilizing your hands 400 times a day, you were a liberal. And if you're people like me, who I don't think I wore a mask more than 2 or 3 times. I mean, I would do it where I had to do it, where you had to wear it in a grocery store. But beyond that, I spent most of COVID licking urinal handles at 7-Elevens because that's how you build an immune system. You don't build an immune system by bathing in Purell, wearing 18 masks while you're driving yourself around in a convertible. And so again, this lunacy that appeared. So it's really stunning. And again, I don't want to be mean about it, and it's not a party thing for me. I don't even know if Trump is a Republican. I like Trump because he makes sense. He makes sense. We're seeing that now with the border situation. It's not sustainable. Everybody knows that. All these cities that held themselves up as sanctuary cities because we're more noble than you, we care about the rest of the world more than you do. And as soon as those people started showing up, that emotion went away. It has become utterly insane. I wrote a piece back in July for the same newspaper of this year, and I equated Trump to almost by proxy becoming the Bob Dylan of our generation. He said, we're turning him into a folk hero. Think of Bob Dylan, hard rains are going to fall, right? I saw guns and sharp swords in the hands of young children. I heard the sound of a wave that could drown the whole world. He was a visionary at his time, and yet Trump comes along and then obviously without the guitar and the frizzy hair, very similar message about these warnings about where this country is going. And I think they're all rooted, again, in pragmatism. It's very hard to argue with most of what he puts forth. And so by accident, almost, the liberal woke left is turning him into a folk hero, and then something happened. I don't understand what it was, but there was something about Trump and Trump winning that it triggered a sensor in the liberal left where, it's been called Trump derangement syndrome and all these different things, which I thought was a little over the top when they first started talking about it. But the more I see it and the more I talk to my liberal friends, Democrat friends, it is kind of a syndrome. It is kind of they don't want to talk about facts. They don't want to talk about reality. It has become an ideology, and trying to convince someone of that ilk that Trump is not a monster is like trying to convince a Christian that God doesn't exist. It's just not going to happen. It's an ideology. It has transcended conversation. And that's a dangerous place to be in this country. See what just happened in New York with the $350 million fraud case against Trump, where most people know, if you're reasonable, that there was no fraud, there was no victim. The very banks that they're saying are victims are saying, Trump was great. We love doing business with him. Look what he did for New York. He's paid over $300 million in taxes in New York in his career there, developing properties and as a real estate mogul. Look at the jobs that he's created. So much of this is fake. And then I wonder where it comes from. I saw a thing a few days ago from 1995, where Jesse Jackson, of all people, is giving a speech in New York, and he is just starting his Rainbow Push Coalition. And his guest speaker, of all people, is Donald Trump. And he starts by saying, yes, the guy has some personality foibles, and I don't defend that. There are many things about Trump that he says that I don't agree with, but they're not enough for me to forego what I think is best for the country. He's got some mutant form of Tourette's syndrome, all right? Instead of blurting out obscenities, he blurts out absurdities. Doesn't bother me that much. I can live with it. He's a New Yorker. People like this tend to be complex personalities, and there's not much you can do about it. But in this video that Jesse Jackson did, again, from 1999, I think, January of 1999, and he introduces Donald Trump, and he said, I wanted to I wanted to have a prominent place to start my Push Rainbow Coalition. Well, we have no money. We have no, kind of wherewithal to get it going. So I called Donald Trump, and Donald Trump offered us free space on Wall Street in one of his buildings. And Jesse Jackson goes on to say how much Donald Trump has done for the African-American community. So this is just one example of many things. So the whole notion that Trump is a racist is inaccurate, in my opinion. I don't know him well, but I did spend time with him in close settings. We're not best friends, but you do get a sense of who a person is. And I did have occasion to interview him on the night before the primary, the first time that he ran and won. I interviewed him for a show I was doing again at WTPL in New Hampshire, and he was very gracious to me. And one of the things that I found most fascinating, he had met my son Dominic one time at a driveway in Bedford, New Hampshire. So I go back to my first story about the little backyard barbecue we did. So fast forward now 9 or 10 months, and doing this little interview was probably 10, 12, 14-minute interview on the radio. And at the end of it, because it was the night of the primary, so we were doing a big event that night in Manchester at the SNHU Arena, the big arena. And at the end of this interview, Trump says, by the way, and he does this, he's very charismatic. He goes, you've been very good to me. I was supposed to do 60 Minutes, but I'm doing your show. And then he says, I know you're going to be at the arena tonight. I'd like you and your son, Dominic, to be my guest at a private function afterwards and come meet my family. He remembered my son's name. All right, so this is almost like Rain Man stuff, right? I mean, you drop a box of toothpicks and he tells you how many toothpicks are on the floor. It was really stunning. He remembered my son's name, having met him once. And unfortunately, my son couldn't come at that time. He was at college in Massachusetts and it was snowing. But I did go that night and I met him, his wife, Melania, Don, Eric, their wives, Jared, pretty close-knit thing. Just phenomenal people. I mean, the nicest people you'd want to ever meet in the world. And I say that as unbiased as I can. Again, I don't want this podcast, videocast, whatever you want to call it, to be all about Donald Trump and pro-Trump, but I do want to explain to people maybe the other side of Trump and how so many people became enamored with him. 80 million people can't be wrong. Some of them could be wrong. Some of their motivation for supporting Trump could be wrong. But I don't think it is. I think it's grounded in very, very real stuff that people have seen for a long time and seen coming for a long time. Um, as I said, that first day in Nashville, he made some really great points. I didn't even expect to be attracted to him. I expected it to be really like a big kind of bloviating speech, but it wasn't that. And he was self-deprecating too, which was really important to me. Like he was able to make fun of himself. And Donald Trump knows who he is, and he knows how he comes off to people. It's not, I think he's way sharper than a lot of people think. So very interesting stuff as we move forward. And then, of course, COVID came. The world changed. I think the government reaction to that was, well, fairly typical government reaction. I mean, for a lot of people like myself, we look back at over the government, it's kind of like Ronald Reagan's famous line about, the 12 words or 9 words, whatever it is that you don't want to hear is, I'm here from the government and I'm here to help. Historically, everything the government has tried to do, it's like the reverse Midas touch, right? They can turn gold to shit. Government tries to control milk prices, right? Screwed it all up. They end up buying out dairy farms, sending all the cows to Canada to be slaughtered. Thanks for the help. You could just go on and on and on. The government's going to help the airline industry. We're going to regulate airline industry. And again, everything they touch, it goes the other way. Because there is no substitute for capitalism. There is no substitute for supply and demand. If you have a product that people want, you have a service that people want, and it's priced reasonably and competitively, then people will buy your product and they'll hire your service. Another thing that was fascinating to me about Trump was the whole Make America Great Again thing, and how the knee-jerk reaction to that from the other side was, he wants us to have separate drinking fountains for Black people again. I mean, it's so utterly insane. No, I think what Trump wants when he says, let's make America great again, he remembers the America as I do, having been born in 1957. He remembers the America that rallied during World War II, where people were saving paper clips and staples and metal drives, and people were willing to sacrifice for the greater good of the country, understanding that Hitler, Nazism had to be defeated. Look at Boeing, an iconic aircraft company, an iconic American company, pumping out B-29s, B-24 bombers, everybody on deck. And now fast forward to today, where, if I'm flying now, I usually get I call it the JTB upgrade when I fly. It's the jet with tight bolts. So here's this magnificent company, Boeing, and I can only imagine this has something to do with diversity hiring or something like that, where they're churning out brand new aircraft with the doors falling off and now pieces of the wings disassembling. I mean, it's really sad when you stop and think about it. And that's something I'm going to dig into deeper in a future episode, is how Boeing itself, the arc of Boeing and aviation being an American stronghold. I mean, the Wright brothers, we invented aviation just over 100 years ago, and look at what we have now. Look at Boeing as a company that developed the 747, one of the most amazing aircraft ever. And I'm a longtime private pilot, so I have a lot of interest in aviation. And I think there's a lot of things about aviation that mirror life itself. And that's something else that I will dig into further down the road. But the Make America Great Again thing is not about a callback to racism. This is a country with blemishes and warts, no question about it, just like all people and all cultures do. But I think we can sometimes go back to better times or better policies and not be unreasonable to look back and say, well, that worked and what we're doing now doesn't work. I think you can say that the nuclear family worked. It produced a better result versus where we are now. We've strayed off into some really different waters. I think people like myself were probably surprised, the liberal woke crowd, if you will, that how open-minded we actually are. I don't care who you love. I don't care what you do behind closed doors. Leave the children out of it. That's where I draw the line. But with adults, I don't care who you love. I wish everybody a happy life filled with love. And that part doesn't bother me at all. But leave the kids out of it. And I think most people would agree with that, or at one time would have. And we've actually come to a place in the country now where we can't even agree on that anymore, which is pretty unsettling when you talk about a political party in this country that wants to name people who have a sexual attraction to children as minor attracted people, as if that's some kind of little personality foible fluke. I am of Italian heritage, and I can tell you where that posture would have got you years ago. And that's, by the way, why all the Italian neighborhoods were always the safest place to be in a city, because you didn't have to worry about the police or judge. You had to worry about getting your genitals mailed to you at the post office 3 days later if you crossed a line like that. And I don't know. I think the fact that we can't even agree on holding minor children sacrosanct anymore says a lot about where we are. So that's what we're going to be digging into with this podcast. Like I said, I kind of struggled with the name of what to call this thing, and maybe it's not going to even matter, but I went back to Bob Dylan and his backup band when they decided to call themselves The Band. So until further notice, this will simply be known as the podcast. I'm Karl Zahn. Thanks for joining me.